Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings for the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We are now turning to the final sections of Song of the Broad Axe. We're going to work with sections 9 through 12 as a unit, just like we did in our previous work. This is often referred to as the shapes section. Some 34 times the word shape or shapes gets used. The shapes arise, or some version of that, will get used some 7 times. Now, our assumptions are that you have been with us at LearnStrong.net, down the left-hand side, Talks with Walt, the name of our playlist, and that you've been working with us from inscriptions all the way up through and including the Song of the Broad Axe passages 4 through 8 that we recently finished. Now, I mentioned inscriptions. I'll want to come back to this, but can you just for a moment remember when we were messing around with inscriptions and the little poem at the very beginning called To Foreign Lands? We've commented already that in Broad Axe, Whitman is clearly wanting to address this idea of how America is different from Europe and all of the European countries. Do you remember this little poem? I heard that you asked for something to prove this puzzle, the New World, and to define America. Notice the use of the word America. We said doesn't get used a tremendous amount in Leaves of Grass. When later in inscriptions we did I Hear America Singing, we commented on this. Her athletic democracy, and we commented when we met this poem early, that this word athletic will carry all different kinds of meanings for Whitman, dynamic, of or related to his view of progress. Therefore I send you my poems, that you behold in them what you wanted. Now, we will pay attention to that set of lines as we come now to passage 9, 10, 11, and 12. The importance of transportation, of passage in Leaves of Grass, we've already commented on a number of times. We're going to see it here. The axe, obviously a symbol from the cradle to the grave, or to the coffin. We're going to see that here. And then we're going to meet in passage 11 Whitman's new woman, as he will celebrate this idea of an athletic democracy. Notice that passage 9 will begin with this parenthetic. We've seen this several times. We immediately think of our Emily Dickinson, don't we? America, exclamation point. Notice the use of the exclamation points in passages 9 through 12. I do not vaunt my love for you. I have what I have. This idea of vaunting, by the way, the only time the word gets used in all of Leaves of Grass is here. This notion of boasting. In other words, I don't have to boast about America. I'm going to tell you just how amazing America really is. The axe leaps. Now we're going to get this idea of action and progression and progress with this idea of arising and leaping. The axe leaps. Now we're going to get a list of some 55 things that the axe can be responsible for. The solid forest gives fluid utterances. Notice the use of solid and fluid. Again, we're back to William Blake and the yin-yang theory and the idea of opposites and all of that, as we've talked about elsewhere at LearnStrong.net. They tumble forth, they rise and form. Fun use of the word tumble here. Evolution, obviously central. And then we get, again, this list of some 55 things. Hut, tent, landing, survey, flail, plow, pick, crowbar, spade, shingle, rail, prop, wainscot. Think about how T.S. Eliot uses wainscot in East Coker. Jam, lathe, panel, gable, citadel, ceiling, saloon, academy. Note the brilliance. In the middle of this 55 numbered list, he puts saloon and academy next door to each other. Isn't that fascinating? He is saying all things are subsumed in the symbol of the axe. In other words, the tool is what allows civilization to create. And I think, following obviously on the ideas of Jordan Peterson and many other thinkers, this idea that civilization has to be constructed over time. But it is very precarious. It is something to be taken seriously in terms of its destruction, because it takes so long to get it constructed. Saloon, academy, organ, exhibition house, we're back to library, cornice, trellis, pilaster, balcony, window, turret, porch. For our future architects, we're enjoying all of this. Hoe, rake, pitchfork, pencil, wagon, staff, saw, jack plane, mallet, wedge, rounce, the handle on a hand press, chair, tub, hoop, table, wicket, vang, sash, floor, obviously all the different parts. I mean, all you have to do is sit where you're sitting right now. Obviously we're in 303. And just pay attention to all the different remarkable ways that this edifice gets built. And think about all the tools that are required or requisite for that. He's celebrating all of that. Workbox, chest, stringed instrument, boat, frame, that's 55 different things. And then he finishes with this and whatnot. Song of the Rolling Earth, number 3, he gets this again. That whatnot's a very American kind of phrase. Then, capitals of states and capital of the nations of states, long stately rows and avenues, obviously all the different things that get built, hospitals for orphans or for the poor or sick. Think about Bellevue in New York in 1736 is built, oldest public hospital. Manhattan steamboats, we obviously think of our Twain when we think of steamboats and clippers, taking the measure of all the seas. Do you remember in Song of Myself, passage 46, never will be measured, this idea of how he loves to use the word measure. He, as we've said, grew up around carpentry, and so he likes the idea of measure and the way that the word measure can be used in so many different ways. And so here we are playing that game. And then we're going to play the game of shapes. And we're going to get 34 of them. So all the different shapes that will arise. In other words, all the different productions. We might say productions. Although when you hear the word shapes, you immediately think of his use of the word ghosts earlier in the poem. Shapes of what? Well, of the using of axes anyhow, and the users and all that neighbors them. Interesting use of the word neighbors. Cutters down of wood, haulers of it to the Penobscot and Kennebec, a couple of native tribes. Dwellers in cabins among the Californian mountains or by the little lakes or on the Columbia. Dwellers south on the banks of the Gila or the Rio Grande. We mentioned his love of rivers. Friendly gatherings. Notice the use of the word friendly, fun, happy as we proceed. Friendly gatherings and the characters. Friendly gatherings, the characters, and fun. Isn't it interesting that in Leaves of Grass, the only time the word fun gets used is right here? Isn't that weird? I love to point those kinds of things out as we're reading this. Dwellers along the St. Lawrence, north in Canada, against the spelling of Canada with the K, or down by the Yellowstone. We obviously are familiar with that, living in Wyoming. Dwellers on coasts and off coasts. Seal fishers, whalers. Obviously we think of Melville's Moby Dick, don't we? Arctic seamen, breaking passages through the ice. This idea of transitions and transportation and passages obviously come to mind. And then another break. The shapes arise. And you'll see the differences in the focus, right, in terms of all these different things that the axe constructs. Shapes of factories, arsenals, foundries, markets, there's 4. Shapes of the 2-threaded tracks of railroads. Think obviously about the power of the railroad as it's happening during the time of Whitman. Shapes of the sleepers of bridges, vast frameworks, girders, arches. By the way, the word sleepers gets used in so many creative ways in Leaves of Grass. Shapes of the fleets, of barges, tows, lake and canal craft, river craft, shipyards, and dry docks along the eastern and western seas, and in many a bay and byplace. Transportation central to how Whitman defines American progress. The live oak kelsons, the pine planks, the spars, the hackmatic roots for knees. Norton's will tell us about this hackmatic roots as larger juniper roots. The knees are structural members of bent wood which bear strains. The ships themselves on their ways, the tiers of scaffolds, the workmen busy outside and inside, the tools lying around, the great auger, the little auger, the adze, the bolt, line, square, gouge, and beeplin. Notice he's using all this carpentry language, this specialty language, assuming his audience will be somewhat familiar with a whole bunch of these terms. And then passage 10 to just continue, although he breaks it up, we'll just keep going. The shapes arise, just like we've used it before. The shape measured, sawed, jacked, joined, strained. Notice he'll start listing these in different orders and numbers, 5 for this one. We're going to talk about how the axe is with us from birth in the form of a cradle to the coffin and death, right? The coffin shaped for the dead to lie within its shroud. The shape got out in posts, in the bedstead posts, in the posts of the bride's bed. The shape of the little trough. And by the way, I just should point out, this idea of posts and beds and all of that, and we're going to get to the issue of chaste versus adulterous here in a little bit. Has to take us back at 3a to our Homer's Odyssey, and you'll remember that beds and how beds are constructed and posts are a part of the validation of Odysseus' return to Penelope. You'll remember this at the end of the Odyssey. We've given full lectures at learnstrong.net over all of those lines from the Odyssey. The shape of the little trough, the shape of the rockers beneath, the shape of the babe's cradle. Obviously, back in the day, everything is made usually by hand, right? The shape of the floor planks for dancers' feet. Hey, can we point out for a moment the way dancing has been such an integral part of our reading? We have, of course, the fun saying in 303, no dancing in room 303 because of our referencing the opening scene of Miller's Crucible. But notice how much dancing becomes central to appreciating Leaves of Grass. The shape of the planks of the family home, the home of the friendly parents and children. Again, this use of the word friendly. The shape of the roof of the home of the happy young man and woman. We're going to get some idealism here, the beautiful idea of the married couple. We've seen this a number of times in Leaves of Grass. The roof over the well-married young man and woman. The roof over the supper, joyously cooked by the chaste wife and joyously eaten by the chaste husband, content after his day's work. Obviously, a very beautiful, idealized kind of representation. And we've seen this already, haven't we, in Leaves of Grass? This idea that a man and a woman can be happily married and they have built their house, possibly built it themselves. Notice the break, and notice how we move from the positive to maybe the negative, right? Whitman's always giving us both sides of the argument, if we can say it that way. The shapes arise. One more time it gets used. The shape now of the prisoner's place in the courtroom, and of him or her seated in the place. The shape, we're up to 20 of these shapes, by the way, of the liquor bar leaned against by the young rum drinker and the old rum drinker. This is interesting stuff. He uses the word lean, by the way. Notice it takes us back to Song of Myself, passage 1. You'll remember what we said earlier in earlier lectures about Whitman and his relationship to the temperance movement. He even wrote a novel about it. The shape of the shamed and angry stairs trod by sneaking footsteps. I find it fascinating. The word sneaking gets here used only once in all of Leaves of Grass. The shape of the sly sati and the adulterous, unwholesome couple, to compare, obviously, with the chaste couple of just a few lines above. The shape of the gambling board with its devilish winnings and losings. You'll remember this devilish from Song of Joys used as well, right? The savage taste of blood, and then he talks about devilish. The shape of the stepladder for the convicted and sentenced murderer. Now you'll remember earlier in passage 8, we were going to get rid of the headsman chopping off heads. And now here we are. We're talking now about how you got to build a scaffold and you need a rope and you're going to hang the murderer. So it's interesting the way that Whitman will play all these different games. The shape of the stepladder for the convicted and sentenced murderer, the murderer with haggard face and pinioned arms. Remember what we said about great poets? They always are showing instead of just telling. Watch this one. The sheriff at hand with his deputies, the silent and white-lipped crowd, the dangling of the rope. It's an amazing, I love to point these kinds of simple moments out in Leaves of Grass. The way that Whitman is able to kind of construct these powerful moments, white-lipped crowd. That is to say, we're going to watch this happen, this hanging, but we're not so excited about it as maybe we thought we would be. And then, of course, the use of the word dangling of the rope. And then, another break, and again, the shapes arise. Shapes of what? Now we're going to get to doors. And obviously, for those of us that love the history of American music, there is a really important band called the Doors that we've talked about elsewhere in other lectures, especially in our William Blake lectures, because Whitman, or Jim Morrison, the lead singer of the Doors, founder of the Doors, was so interested in Blake, and I think he read his Whitman as well. The shapes arise, shapes of doors. Think about all the doors that are going to play games in Leaves of Grass. Obviously, Lilacs, Last in the Door, Your Bloom will come to mind. Giving many exits and entrances. The door passing, the dissevered friend, flushed and in haste. The door that admits good news and bad news. The door whence the son left home confident and puffed up. the door. He entered again from a long and scandalous absence, diseased, broken down, without innocence, without means. The idea, and it takes us to Telemachus, doesn't it, of the son leaving and then coming back, and all the doors that we go through. And of course, it leads us to an interesting meditation. Think of all the doors you have gone through, literally and figuratively in your life, come back and forth through. And then in passage 11, taking us back to passage number 5, we get Whitman's treatment of the new woman. Some have seen this almost like thrown in here. It's going to take us back to I Sing the Body Electric, passage 5, as well as A Woman Waits for Me. His celebration of the feminine, the new American woman. Her shape rises. She, and now we're going to get 15 she's. She, less guarded than ever, the progress. More guarded than ever. The yin-yang symbol has to come to mind here, right, of both sides of it. The gross and soiled she moves among, do not make her gross and soiled. Of course, it's fascinating, his use of the word gross and soiled in Leaves of Grass is obviously, we've commented on elsewhere. She knows the thoughts as she passes. Nothing is concealed from her. And back to earlier comments about how this almost seems like he's making those references to the book of Proverbs in the Bible and the idea of wisdom as being feminine. She is none the less considerate or friendly, therefore. She is the best beloved. It's without exception. She has no reason to fear, and she does not fear. That is to say, for Whitman, the new American woman will be a woman without any fear. Now, obviously, I mean, guys, we cannot overstate the importance of lines like this in a time where still men consider women very much beneath them, especially politically and socioeconomically. Oaths, quarrels, hiccuped songs, smutty expressions are idle to her as she passes. By the way, the only use of the word hiccuped in all of Leaves of Grass is right here. Smutty makes us go back. The only other time it gets used in all Leaves of Grass is in the poem A Glimpse, smutty jest. Expressions are idle to her as she passes. In other words, the American woman for the modern woman, the modern American democratic woman for Whitman walks among all this nastiness and is somehow unscathed by it. She is silent, which is interesting that he would use that phrase. She is possessed of herself. They do not offend her. In other words, you can't offend this strong American woman. She is beyond offending. In other words, she's every much as strong as the man. She receives them as the laws of nature, notice capitalized to make us think of our Emerson. Receive them. She is strong. We have to go back to our strong being of passage 6 because we're going to get it again. She too is a law of nature. Remember in passage 5 we were talking about how children are taught to be laws unto themselves. And then notice the use of the dash, which makes us immediately think of Emily Dickinson. There is no law stronger than she is. Now, if what we said earlier in this poem about getting rid of all slaves and slave masters is radical, this is as well extremely radical for Whitman's readers of his day. We guys have a tendency to look at a set of lines like this and to go, well, yeah, obviously men and women are of equal ability in every way. But guys, when Whitman's publishing this, this is a major, major radical statement for him. And then he finishes very quickly in passage 12. The main shapes arise. Shapes of democracy. Go back to what we read into Foreign Lands, right, earlier. Total result of centuries. This idea that, and Whitman really believed this, that America was the penultimate evidence of cultural evolution, of political evolution. It's been a long time coming. In other words, we grew like grass out of all of the soil of Europe to become what we are. Shapes ever projecting other shapes. In other words, what it is that we're going to produce next. He's going to get to the whole earth here at the end of this. Shapes of turbulent, manly cities. Before it was athletic democracy, here it's manly. It plays the same game. Hey, do you remember though? I love how he plays this game. Do you remember the opening lines of passage 24 of Song of Myself? Walt Whitman, a cosmos of Manhattan, the sun, turbulent, Fleshy, sensual, eating, drinking, and breeding, no sentimentalist, no stander above men and women or apart from them, no more modest than immodest. And then he says it, unscrew the locks from the doors, to go back to this earlier set of lines, unscrew the doors themselves from their jambs. Whoever degrades another degrades me, and whatever is done or said returns at last to me, through me. The afflatus surging and surging, through me, the current and index. I speak the password primeval, I give the sign of democracy, although in passage 24, not capitalized at this moment. By God, I will accept nothing which all cannot have their counterpart of on the same terms. Here he is, shapes of turbulent, manly cities, in the same way that Whitman himself identifies himself as turbulent, and yet somehow that is a positive and not a negative. He will say the same of the great cities of America. We have to think of Sandburg's Chicago, no question, when we read that. Shapes of the friends, we've seen friendly, happy, even the word fun gets used in this poem, and home givers of the whole earth. We're going to get earth now 3 times, right? Shapes bracing the earth and braced with the whole earth. By the way, notice, we move from America to the whole earth. And that's going to get us ready to read passage to India, as we commented when we read Salute Amon. Well, what are we going to say in these final sections now of Broad Acts? Well, true democracy cannot be stopped. All the world will somehow be affected and united by American democracy. Again, we called it not a blind optimism, but an informed optimism. I mean, he's trying to make the argument that what was started so long ago will come to fruition in America. At 2b, what are we going to say about the rhetoric? Well, obviously the repetition of the word shapes, for example, 34 times being used. But I want to comment in final here about the power of the symbol of the acts, the broad acts, right? The symbol of the unrealized dream, the hoped for dream.